I used to say to my rangers, we're not going to run away from controversy, we're running right at it. It is not your job to present your opinion. It is your job to extract the public's opinion. Saint or madman. Murderer or liberator. Devil or martyr. Terrorist or freedom fighter. Who is Brown? Working for the National Park Service for decades, we don't often speak in an environment like this. The environment is the environment. You're out. And I suspect most of you have been to Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is beautiful, but it's also loud. There's a lot of ambient noise in Harper's Ferry, captured by the mountains, echoing off the mountains, and echoing right back at you if you're the park ranger that's leading a program. And so our park rangers at Harper's Ferry learn how to project. We don't use any sort of magnified sound systems typically when we're out. And I've done programs at Harper's Ferry where I've had as many as 350 people on a program, and they hear me. They're able to hear me. And so it's really unusual for me to be in a space like this when I'm so used to having the open sky and the open air and sunshine all around me as a park ranger. But I have retired from being a park ranger. I did that for close to 40 years, and I want to thank you. I worked for you. I was your public servant, and I mean that in the way of gratitude. I tell people, I grew up in the Harpers Ferry area. I grew up only a few minutes from where the national park is. That's home for me. I've lived in that area all my life. My family on both my mother's side and my dad's side go back in the Harpers Ferry area, roots very deep. Nearly 250 years has my family been in that area. And so it is truly a place where my genes have existed for a long time. And every day that I came to work at Harpers Ferry, I never came to work there. I came to worship there. Every day. And you gave me that privilege. I have been privileged also to deal with an individual in American history. You know, it's not too often that one individual changes who we are. The Congress may change who we are. The president has some ability to change who we are. When I say who we are, I'm talking about us, U.S. and us, all of us collectively, a collective nation. Change usually occurs through movements, not necessarily by individuals. King is an individual that leads a movement. King does not succeed as an individual. The movement succeeds. Carrie Nation does not succeed as an individual. The movement succeeds. Frederick Douglass does not succeed as an individual. And so, John Brown has no movement that he's in charge of. He is an individual. He is participating in the evolutionary movement of our country, but he's not sanctioned. He's very much operating as an individual. So the transformation that John Brown brings as an individual is extraordinary. Extraordinary. And also controversial. I love Brown because we can't agree on Brown. This is the wonder of Brown. I have led so many discussions in my national park with ranger staff about Brown. And all the rangers have opinions about Brown. Good. Don't you dare share your opinion publicly, ever. Because it is not your job to present your opinion. It is your job to extract the public's opinion, to hear them speak about Brown, to have them tell you what they think of Brown. I used to even threaten the park rangers by saying, if I ever hear of any of you expressing your individual opinion of Brown before the public, you're fired. Because that's not what we were there to do. We were there to facilitate, to encourage conversation, and bring the disagreement forward. I used to say to my rangers, we're not going to run away from controversy, we're running right at it. We're going right at it. Because Americans who run from controversy are cowards. Americans who challenge and accept controversy, then we are practicing the very words of the First Amendment. So John Brown gives us an opportunity to run right at it, to acknowledge that we don't agree. And in our country, the law, the Constitution says that we can disagree. So let's do so. So I'm going to start with something that's quite fascinating. I had a personal tour of the catacombs here, where you have so many thousands of objects given by your chief curator, Robert, and I enjoyed it very much. He had some very special things that he showed me. I, at Harper's Ferry, the collections managers, one of my responsibilities was the collections managers, the curators worked for me. I would spend a lot of time in the collection, a lot of time with objects. I have something here that's very ancient. I mean, Richmond certainly didn't know the cigarette industry. I can remember going up and down 95, crossing the James River and smelling tobacco in the air. It was pervasive. So this is an old magazine, because you don't do, what's the name of that cigarette? Terryton. Yeah, this is a very old magazine that I'm holding here. Now, technically, my wife also is a curator, collections manager. I probably should have gloves on, but she did find something to put on that's acid-free, so I'm not touching it. But I'm going to turn this around for you in just a moment so you can see this. I discovered this one day when I was in the park archives. It was completely serendipitous. I had no idea. And I thought, wow, look at that. I'm going to just give you a clue before I show it to you. The year is 1959. This magazine is 1959. That's, what is that, 65 years ago? Close to 64 years ago? Okay. Why am I beginning with a magazine that's 64 years old with a cigarette advertisement? Seems no relevance to John Brown at all. Well, 1959 is relevant to Brown. It is the centennial of Brown. It is the kickoff of the American Civil War centennial. Brown. This magazine is not something you haven't heard of. This is a Newsweek magazine, internationally renowned. The front cover in 1959 in bold yellow banner says, "Space, missiles, must we always be second best?" Second to the Russians, of course. But that's not what caught my attention. And that's not why this magazine was in the archives of Harper's Ferry National Park. This is what caught my attention. This is an image of John Brown in 1959, superimposed over a gallows. On the front cover of Newsweek magazine, 100 years after John Brown. What historical figure could command such attention. The most important people of any magazine are the people that decide the cover, because the cover is what sells the magazine. And those editors chose John Brown. And I think this is really interesting too. Some of the highest paid people, writers on magazine staffs, write the headlines, write the titles. And although you can't see it, at the bottom of Brown and the Scaffold are the words, John Brown's raid, the spark still smolders. A spark that has been burning for 100 years. Prima facie evidence of the effect of Brown on us. This led me a few years ago for the sesquicentennial. Harper's Ferry National Park was the very first of the national parks to participate in the 150th anniversary of the commemoration of the American Civil War. And I was responsible for organizing our events and the Park Service kickoff. We focused on John Brown in 2009. And I wrote an article that appeared in the American Battlefield Trust National Magazine, Hallowed Ground, as part of that kickoff. And I just want to share a short sentence from that article. What do you do with John Brown? No, not John Brown's body, but John Brown's anniversary. How do you deal with a body that has stopped moldering, but whose soul is still smoldering? Americans deliberate Brown. Americans debate Brown. But Brown is not of our intellect. Instead, we feel John Brown. Brown is not about our brains, but about our souls. Brown is embedded in our collective conscious, America's consciousness. Saint or madman, murderer or liberator, devil or martyr, terrorist or freedom fighter. Who is Brown? What is Brown? Why do we still have Brown? John Brown is not what we think, but what we feel. There was a lot of emotion in 1859. You know what happened. Brown has committed himself to the eradication, the abolition of slavery. Unlike other abolitionists, Brown is willing to use violence. Brown intends to launch a war. That's what he calls it, a war against slavery. The first assault will occur at Harper's Ferry because we have weapons there. As you know, here in Virginia, and that Harper's Ferry was Virginia, of course, there's an armory, and they manufacture weapons there. There are 100,000 United States rifles and muskets at Harper's Ferry that Brown targets first so that he has weapons for his war. We all know about weapons for war. Ask the Ukrainians. You have to have the weapons. And you also know the rest of the story. He did not succeed. He would be surrounded in the fire engine house of the Armory, today known as John Brown's Fort. United States Marines arrive. Robert E. Lee will be in command of those Marines. There will be an assault on the fire engine house. Brown will be injured but not killed. it's over. But it's not over. Brown is still living. And as a living Brown, he will be taken to Charlestown, the central court of Jefferson County, placed on trial. He will be found guilty and he will be executed. That's Brown's story. But that's not the story. That's not the story that endures. That's not the story that transforms. The reaction to Brown is what begins to bring in this metamorphosis of who we are. The reaction. And I think it's appropriate to start here in Virginia with one of your own who lives fairly close to us, John Tyler. Former President John Tyler, just down the river a bit, along Route 5. That's where he is. This is where he wrote this statement. And let me share his exact words. In the immediate aftermath of Brown, these words that you're going to hear are expressions of feeling. President Tyler, quote, Virginia is arming to the teeth. More than 50,000 stands of arms already distributed, and the demand for more daily increasing. What does that tell you? You're afraid. Why would you go buy 50,000 arms? Self-defense. There must be more Browns. You'll be ready. Secessionists delighted in John Brown's attack at Harper's Ferry. There is no peace for this South in this Union, declared the Charleston, South Carolina Mercury newspaper. And the Richmond Enquirer, I thought this would be nice to include, the Richmond Enquirer, in 1859, notes less joyfully that Brown's attack had, quote, swelled the ranks of the secessionists by tenfold. And as might be expected, another Virginian, another one of your near neighbors, Edmund Ruffin, rejoiced in Brown's outrages, as he called them, outrages, exclaiming, and I quote, they will stir the sluggish blood of the South. As Brown's trial began 1 week after his capture, Virginia's determination to defend her borders became apparent. Now this particular statement I want to share with you was delivered in your capital, only a few blocks from here. These words rang out in the Virginia Capitol building. Listen to them. Feel them. All Virginia, the delegate says, will stand forth as one man and say to fanaticism that whenever you advance a hostile foot upon our soil, we will welcome you with bloody hands and hospitable graves. James L. Kemper to the General Assembly. Now, you should not be surprised by this Southern outpouring of outrage. For nearly 30 years, the South has felt itself attacked by hostile and emotional Northerners. The likes of Garrison and his newspaper, The Liberator, the Underground Railroad, where property, slave property, literally leaves and money is lost with that property. The freedom laws in the North, which protect those that were previously enslaved. Then, of course, there is the fugitive slave law, where northern states just simply negate it or just simply ignore it, pay no attention to it. All of these had steadily raised the Southern emotional thermometer. Brown's attack was a direct stab at the peculiar institution. Brown's threatened insurrection evoked, and you here in Virginia would certainly know, evoked the fearful memory of Nat Turner. But Brown was a horror worse than Turner. Because you see, insurrections led by African Americans, those enslaved, was expected. Any Southerner would tell you that quietly, silently, every day, every night, every breath, they were in terror of insurrection. They should be. Human beings are not meant to be slaves. But Brown was not a black man. Brown was white. John Brown had come into Virginia as a white man, according to Virginia, to lead slaves on an insurrection. Unthinkable. Brown declared ending slavery his mission. Brown is a Northerner. Brown is financed by Northerners. John Brown is poison. The fruit of satanic doctrine, wrote the editor of the Petersburg, Virginia Express newspaper. A fruit, the editor wrote, inculcated by the verbal and unprincipled teachers of the Garrison, Greeley, and Seward schools. Our friend President Tyler, former President Tyler, summed up well the response to John Brown when he wrote, "But one sentiment pervades this country: security to the Union or separation." Okay, well, what's happening in the North? What is the reaction north of the Mason-Dixon line? Well, this might surprise you. The initial northern reaction was quite uncomplimentary, very uncomplimentary. "We view the actions of Brown and his associates in no other light than that as bloody murderers," intoned the newspaper, the New York Herald. The Chicago Tribune in 1859 affirmed the sentiment of its New York sister paper. The Tribune labeled Brown and his followers, quote, "a squad of fanatics, commanded by a man who is as mad as a March hare." Brown and his men, the Tribune concluded, are guilty of the most incomprehensible stupidity, folly, as well as unpardonable criminality. This stark, mad enterprise was the product of addled brains. Now, not all Northerners were as quick to condemn Brown. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great, great philosopher from Concord, representing his transcendental perspective, had this to say, that John Brown is a pure idealist of artless goodness. Louisa May Alcott, his neighbor, his younger protege, worshiped Brown as, quote, St. John the Just. William Lloyd Garrison compared Brown's efforts at the Revolution with that of America's fight for independence. Was John Brown justified in his attempt? Garrison roared, "Yes, by God, if Washington was in his." And Wendell Phillips, who was an outspoken supporter of Brown, he was a preacher there in Boston, also alluded to the Revolution of 1776 when he declared, "Harper's Ferry is the Lexington of today." Perhaps Henry David Thoreau summed up best the quintessential thought of New England's intellectuals when he proclaimed Brown as the best news America has ever heard. Now, there were many factors that produced a John Brown, that created a Brown, that inspired John Brown. In our case, national case, the gag rule. Our representatives in the Congress were not permitted to speak about slavery. They gagged themselves. It's too controversial. We can't talk about controversy. The Fugitive Slave Act we mentioned, and the fact that it was just ignored in northern states. But the very act itself inspired John Brown to become even more vehemently anti-slavery. The popular sovereignty that occurred in the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, you all know what happened. Well, let's just put the extension of slavery in the hands of the people. Pure democracy. That was a disaster. Don't ever put questions like that in the hands of the people. And of course we know that produced civil war in Kansas. Brown goes there with his sons, fights, becomes famous as a guerrilla fighter to not permit the extension of slavery. But without doubt, the most important national action that completely engulfed Brown and completely enraged him, which led him to commit to total war, to the total eradication of slavery. That one national act came from our Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court. Yes, Dred Scott. Supreme Court decisions we are very aware of. Whether we agree or disagree, they affect us dramatically. Dred Scott had that kind of effect upon Brown. So much so that Brown decides, you know something? Forget the United States government. Forget all the opportunities we have to bring about change, metamorphosis through the United States government. It's not going to happen. I'll just take things into my own hands. Brown goes to Chatham, Canada, which had become a refuge for those that had freed themselves. There were many formerly enslaved that lived in Chatham, Canada. And Brown holds a constitutional convention in Chatham where he creates his own government and his own constitution. One of the provisions of this new constitution is that as soon as the United States government eradicates slavery, his constitution is no longer valid. He's not attempting to overthrow the United States. He's going to create a country of his own within the United States where those that were previously enslaved can live. And it needs its own government. It needs its own constitution. So it's called the Provisional Constitution. Provisional means temporary. Temporary. It was, in other words, it was not an insurrection that would attempt to change anything in the United States with the exception of one thing. Let's eradicate slavery. I just want to share with you quickly the preamble. The preamble is a beautiful piece of prose. I'm sure most of you are not familiar with John Brown's preamble to his Provisional Constitution. Listen to this. Whereas, we always have to start with whereas slavery throughout its entire existence in the United States is none other than a most barbarous, unprovoked, unjustifiable war of one portion of its citizens upon another portion, the only condition of which are perpetual imprisonment, hopeless servitude, or absolute extermination. All in utter disregard of those eternal and self-evident trusts set forth in our Declaration of Independence. Therefore, we, citizens of the United States and the oppressed people, do, for the time being, ordain and establish for ourselves a provisional constitution to better protect our persons, property, lives, and liberties. Call to action. One other thing you need to know about John Brown. He is a man of God. He believes God has chosen him specifically He is God's instrument. His mission that God has given him, he is certain of. Few people probably read the Bible more than Brown. His favorite verse in all those hundreds and hundreds of thousands of words, his favorite verse is this: remember them that are in bonds as you bound with them. As one observer would write, the book as a whole was his creed, and upon its teachings he placed his personal interpretations. With the arm of Jehovah protecting him and the Bible providing his guidance, Brown determined to meddle directly in the peculiar institution. There will be no more peace in this land until slavery is done for, Brown exclaimed. I will give them something else to do than to extend slave territory. I will carry this war into Africa. Africa is a code word. You are Africa. Virginia is Africa. Brown does not have to cross the Atlantic to start his war, only the Potomac. Well, we all know, again, that the actual attack fails. But regardless of that failure, Brown now faced new opportunity. Stripped of the sword, Brown found new power in the Word. Within hours of his capture, it became evident that even in captivity, John Brown determined to continue his crusade against slavery as a captive, as a prisoner. You know what who his favorite ally was? Newspapers. Newspapers. Newspapers, social media. The only form of social media. The only form of widespread communication in existence on the planet is newspapers. I love reading historic newspapers. You can go online and there's hundreds of thousands of pages of historic newspapers now that you can read. If you want to know what they were feeling, don't worry about what they're thinking. Historians spend way too much time on what they're thinking. It's much more important to know what they're feeling. Newspapers tell you what they feel. Go, read them. So newspapers, Brown knew, Charlestown suddenly was flooded with newspaper writers from all over the North and the South. Dozens and dozens and dozens of them came representing their newspapers. Famous newspapers, not famous newspapers. They descended on Charlestown. It is a spectacle. It is a spectacle unlike any that we have seen in American history. Brown knows this. He knows the power of a newspaper. And so when he is interviewed soon after he is captured by your senator, Virginia United States Senator James Mason, at Harper's Ferry, in a building right beside the John Brown Fort, wounded but conscious, very able to speak and very capable of knowing his surroundings. This is what John Brown said to Mason, but he wasn't speaking to Mason. He was speaking to the newspaper reporters that were covering it. He would say to Senator Mason in response to a question, I think, my friend, you are guilty of a great wrong against God and humanity. He would continue, I pity the poor in bondage that have none to help them. That is why I am here. And newspapers recorded exactly those words to the telegraph office, and Brown was coverage every day. Every day. equivalent to front page coverage. Brown's measured words would soon bring an outpouring of sympathy from abolitionist brethren in the North. You might, and this is not meant to be political, but something like this just recently happened in our own existence. On January 6th, almost everybody was horrified. There's been a transformation. Everyone seemed horrified by the attack at Harper's Ferry. It was an attack upon the United States government. And there's a transformation brought about by John Brown. In a letter to his wife, he knew he was building a road to martyrdom. In a letter to his wife, Mary, November 11th, so this is only about 3 weeks after he's been captured. He's already been tried. He's already been sentenced. He's writing home to his wife, Mary. This is what he wrote. I have been whipped, as the saying goes, but I am sure I can recover all of the lost capital occasioned by my disaster by only hanging a few moments by my neck. On November the 2nd, only 2 weeks after his capture, John Brown is sentenced to die on the gallows for murder. People were killed during this attack, including the mayor of Harper's Ferry. Mayor of Harper's Ferry is killed. Treason. The Constitution, the Provisional Constitution, was found on John Brown. And inciting slave rebellion. No enslaved were technically freed, but he was charged with and found guilty of slave rebellion. Each of these is a capital offense. Each demands the death penalty. That's what the judge says too. But some would argue that Virginia was making a grave error. Better to declare Brown insane rather than to hang him. Here is one of my very favorite quotes. This comes from what is today the Wall Street Journal. It was not known as that in 1859. It was known as the New York Journal of Commerce. It's the Wall Street Journal. This is what the editor said about Virginians executing Brown. To hang a fanatic is to make a martyr of him. Better to send these creatures to the penitentiary and so make of them miserable felons. And in a graphic warning to the South regarding Virginia's decision to execute Brown, the Journal of Commerce editor concluded. Hear these words. Monsters are hydra-headed, and decapitulation of the monster only quickens its vitality and its powers of reproduction. Well, despite these warnings, Judge Richard Parker decided the noose was the proper way to dispose of Brown. So on November the 2nd, Brown will be sentenced, and the court will say, do you have anything to say? Brown will rise. It's a 5-minute oration. I'm going to give you about 1 minute. There are no notes. It is just oratory. I have, may it please the court, a few words to say. I deny everything but what I have all along admitted of a design on my part to free slaves. That was all I intended to do. I never did intend murder or treason or the destruction of property or to excite or incite slave rebellion. Had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or on behalf of any of their friends, it would have been all right. He concluded with this. I believe to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, on behalf of his despised poor, is no wrong but right. So, Brown, a man of God, follower of the Bible, friend of the poor, enemy of the rich, a man about to be executed. Perfect ingredients for martyrdom. As one New England writer would say, John Brown had become the conquering prisoner of Charlestown Jail. December the 2nd, a beautiful, crisp Shenandoah Valley day, 3 blocks from the courthouse is the execution site. Brown will be escorted up the gallows, and at 11:30 a.m., the noose and the rope. And as one writer would state, for a moment, John Brown dangled between heaven and hell. It was silent when that trap door opened. There were 2,000 Virginia soldiers there, standing in silence. There were no civilians there, not permitted. But breaking the silence was the voice of the commander of the Virginia Military Institute, John T.L. Preston, who was there with the cadets. Thomas Jackson was there, as you know. John Wilkes Booth was there with a Richmond militia unit, as you know, the Richmond Grays. Preston's voice in that silence, as Brown is literally dangling, Preston shouts, "So perish all such enemies of Virginia, all such enemies of the Union, all such enemies of the human race." But Brown did not perish. He's dead, but he is not gone. In an effort to continue his battle against slavery, eulogy after eulogy springs up in the North. Thoreau, these men, in teaching us how to die, have at the same time taught us how to live. Wendell Phillips coins Brown, the Lord High Admiral of the Almighty, who has twice as much right to hang Governor Wise as Governor Wise has to hang him. And of course, this, you know this is coming. Many will compare John Brown to Jesus Christ. Emerson will declare that Brown is the saint whose death made the gallows glorious like the cross. Thoreau boldly claims that the cross and the gallows are linked, and that Brown is not old Brown anymore, but an angel of light. Many New England intellectuals are in agreement that as Christ had died to make men holy, John Brown had died to make men free. Now, the prominent authors and scholars of the day in New England, only Nathaniel Hawthorne seemed to see no merit in John Brown. Nobody was more justly hanged, he would write. But there is a Southern response. A Southern response. And it's not that. It is not that. Southern newspapers publish these reflections of their northern brethren, and they're saying, what? What? Who are you? You can't possibly be us. You can't possibly be an American. He committed murder. Why are you praising him? He committed treason. Why are you lifting him up? He wanted our slaves to rebel. What is wrong with you people up there? The Southern response is best summarized by a newspaper in Savannah. the Savannah Daily Morning News. This is what their editor had to say about John Brown. The notorious horse thief, murderer, insurrectionist, traitor. There are thousands of white cravated necks in New England and the northern states today that are just as deserving of John Brown's hemp-pin tie. Others viewed Northern sympathy for Brown as absolute justification for secession. Jefferson Davis, who at this time, of course, is a United States Senator representing Mississippi, in the Capitol, in the Senate chamber, will declare, "Have we no right to secure our rights and protect our honor, even if we dissever the ties that bind us together, and even if it rushes us into a sea of blood?" The Charleston Mercury will announce, "Day of compromise is past. The South must control her own destinies or perish." And the Richmond Enquirer would note, and I quote your editor, "The Harper's Ferry invasion has advanced the cause of disunion more than any event since the formation of this government." So, what is the legacy of Brown? Why, 100 years later, is he on the front cover of an international magazine? What is his legacy? Only you can answer that. Only you know what Brown's legacy is. Is Brown a saint? Or is he a madman? Is he the devil? Or is he a martyr? Is he a terrorist? Or is he a freedom fighter? I don't know. Do you? Perhaps, as Shakespeare once said, John Brown, he didn't know John Brown, but this comment may reflect what Brown truly is, that we've made much ado about nothing. No, that's not fitting. We have made much ado about something. And then finally, I want to say, what about Brown's religion? What about God choosing him? What about him performing God's will? And what about our law, our laws? You know, man's law often runs counter to God's law. Ours is a country of laws. Our laws represent us. Our laws protect us. Our laws define us. John Brown broke the law. That is unquestionable. Brown did commit murder. Unquestionable. He did commit treason. He did intend to incite rebellion. Our laws forbid this. Yet Thoreau had an interesting point when he asked, and I quote, "Is it not possible that an individual may be right and a government wrong? Are laws to be enforced simply because they were made?" I want to summarize Brown like this. It takes an epic, these aren't my words, but a distinguished author who was living during the 19th century. It takes an epic It takes the whole of a society to produce a John Brown. Everyone living at the time takes some part in that episode. And perhaps a newspaper in Kansas, the Lawrence Republican, the name of the newspaper, the Lawrence Republican, pictured John Brown best when it wrote soon after his execution, and I quote, "It is safe to say that the death of no man in America had ever produced so profound a sensation." But the question remains today, now 160 plus years later, why are we still sensing the sensation? Sensations evaporate. John Brown's sensation lives. I love your exhibits here. I really appreciated the John Brown pikes at the front of the exhibit room this evening that you have here in the collection. As my role as chief historian at Harper's Ferry National Park, I had a lot of influence on exhibits. And we have a large John Brown museum. And when you walk in there, the first words you see are these words, because I wanted you to see these words. They're not mine. But these words, in a couplet, a poetic couplet, completely characterize John Brown. Saint, madman. Martyr, devil. Terrorist, freedom fighter. Stephen Vincent Benet had the answer to all of that. Stephen Vincent Benet, in his epic poem, John Brown's Body, summarized Brown like this, and I don't need my notes. When I first read this at age 18, I never forgot it. Benet, you, and he's speaking to each one of us, you can weigh John Brown's body well enough. But how and in what balance weigh John Brown? And it's been a pleasure to share Brown with you this evening. Thank you. Anybody want to let's go. I always get excited about the opportunity. Oh, my Ben, first question. It must be planted. This has to be a planted question. Yes, sir.
So I always appreciate when people speaking about John Brown give the transcendentalists their due regards.
You are welcome.
One of the most interesting things that I think Thoreau says about Brown is that he was a transcendentalist above all, even though that's probably not a word Brown would have used to describe himself. I'm wondering if you can talk about where John Brown fits in the idea of what a pure transcendentalist is.
Well, oh my.
He said hardball.
The answer is read Thoreau's ode to John Brown, which completely explains, in Thoreau's own words, as a transcendentalist, living as a transcendentalist himself, how Brown fits so well into that particular philosophy. I had the privilege several years ago of actually lecturing in Concord on Brown in the church where Thoreau delivered that lecture. And I used his words as they echoed off the same church. was quite it was one of my favorite moments in my career as a historian. But he knew all these people quite well. He spent time up there. He had visited in their homes. Louisa May actually knew him. I mean, she wasn't just some figure. Brown had been there. He knew the Alcotts. He knew Emerson. He knew Thoreau. He knew Franklin Sanborn. All these people that was this Concord, the transcendental center of the world, Concord. Brown went there purposely because Brown wanted the intellectuals to support him. They knew, again, the greatest power of that day is the written word. That is the only form of mass communication, the written word. And so the writers must support me. The writers must magnify my message. And so the transcendentalists, of course, are internationally renowned. And since they personally know Brown, I think their words in the aftermath of the capture and then with the execution are all the more poignant and all the more powerful because of their personal connection. If he was a stranger and they had never met him, they still would have been very supportive of Brown using violence to overcome slavery. Abolitionists were Martin Luther Kings. We're not going to be violent here, people. That's not the way we're going to change anything. Brown was the antithesis of those abolitionists. Did the Concord philosophers know his plan? No, they didn't. They didn't know his plan. But they knew that he was willing to kill if anyone tried to stop him in his plan. And they strangely accept this, but maybe it's not so strange, because from a transcendental point of view, enslavement is death. Correct? Yeah. So Brown basically is willing to kill so others will no longer die. Yes, ma'am.
Did he have a friendship with Frederick Douglass?
Yes, very close. Very close. Let me share something with you that I think in John Brown history is very much ignored because it didn't happen. It didn't happen. There's so many things that don't happen that then history scuttles, doesn't discuss. But sometimes what doesn't happen is just as important as what does. Douglass and Brown conceived a plan that was not insurrection. Now let me repeat that. Douglass and Brown together conceive a plan that is not insurrection, but it's going to free the enslaved. Here's the plan. Preface, and this is hard. This is really hard. None of us are going to like what you're about to hear. I hate sharing this with you. According to definition by our United States Supreme Court, a slave is not human. A slave is property. Slave breathes, a slave eats, a slave talks, a slave walks, a slave thinks, a slave feels. You are not human. You are property. Property has value. 1860 in Jefferson County, Virginia, one 18-year-old male enslaved on the block commands, I know this because I've researched it, $1,600. So what? Well, here's the so what. The average salary of an American worker in 1860 for an entire year is $300 a year. $1,600 for one field hand. Value. So the Douglas-Brown plan is this. Let's make an assumption for a moment that I am an enslaver. And I enslave 50 pieces of property. And just to make math simple, let's say that the average value of my enslaved, as the enslaver, is $1,000 per. That's $50,000 of property. Now you know that that is more value in the slave property than in my mansion, than in my fields, than in my horses and my cows and my pigs. $50,000. John Brown's Army of Liberation shows up at my estate one night. They encourage all 50 of the enslaved to self-liberate. They are going to escort them to freedom, this army. No shots fired. I don't know anything. I don't hear anything. The next morning, I arise, and there's a word for me. Bankrupt. That's the plan. The Douglas-Brown plan is economic warfare. To literally devalue slave property by making the security insecure. It's brilliant. It is brilliant. Every one of us in this room, I bet, have lost money on the stock market because people panic. If values go down, it can take everything down. And that's exactly what the intention is, to bankrupt the oligarchy, the slave oligarchy. So that your property becomes valueless. And why would you maintain and hold valueless property? That's the plan he and Douglas came up with. Now, he asked Douglas to join him. Douglas would refuse. Douglas later, 1881, comes to Harper's Ferry and gives a speech on John Brown. It's a beautiful speech, great oratory. And Douglas expresses regret that he did not join Brown. I don't think he regretted it at all, because Douglas's voice and his pen was so much more powerful behind the lines than on the front. And Douglas knew that. So Douglas made the right decision. But they were very, very close. Yes, sir.
You touched on how Bleeding Kansas was a disaster. How did Brown ease out of Bleeding Kansas without being under the microscope and be able to go on and set up his Constitution and his plans for revolt?
Exactly like the fugitive slave laws. Here is a man, John Brown, who absolutely is a convict based on law, who's just roaming around Concord, Massachusetts. Everybody knows he's there. Everybody knows who he is. Goes into Boston. Hello, I'm John Brown. Oh, how nice to meet you. I've heard so much about you. Will you come have dinner with me? There were no federal marshals trying to chase him down. He was very well protected in New England and Northern society. Brown was even out raising money. I mean, he would go into churches and go into society halls, lecture about his experience in Kansas, and money would come in. And so, yes, he was a wanted man. He had a price on his head, but nobody turned him in. So it was, it was a fairly easy thing for them to do because they had already had 10 years of not returning fugitives, of protecting and defending fugitives against federal authorities and federal law. And this just absolutely incensed Southerners. They knew he was up there. And so why is the law not being applied? There's not justice here. What gives New England the right to say, well, we're not going to arrest John Brown, even though he's a federal fugitive? We're just not going to. We're just not going to do that. What gives them that right? That was the question Southerners are asking. It's a very legitimate question. Yes, go ahead.
In all of his flurry of letters after he was captured, how much did he speak about his sons that died? 'Cause I know 2 died at Harper's Ferry and 1 had already died in Kentucky.
Kansas.
Kansas.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Brown family was committed to John Brown. The Brown family was as much mission oriented and focused as Brown was, and was willing to die for him. And you're right, 3 of his sons will die in this war. 2 of them at Harper's Ferry, in the fire engine house, will die at his feet. How does this affect Brown? He simply looks at them as warriors, as soldiers, who, like himself, is willing to die. They just preceded him. He would speak of Frederick, his son, who was killed in Kansas. He would not use the word killed. He would use the word murdered. Murdered. But yeah, Oliver and Watson are the 2 that will die at his feet inside the fire engine house. And any father, I think it's humanly impossible to not see this happen, watch this happen, and not have some emotion. But Brown was so focused on a larger picture, a larger mission. Everything was larger than himself. And so we don't know precisely what he thinks at the moment. But certainly there had to be a momentary sense of loss, but at the same time, there had to be a great sense of pride. These are my sons. They are dying for what I believe in. They are great sons. Yes, ma'am.
Didn't the authorities, I don't know if I'm using the proper word, were they aware of what he was doing? He lived in, the planning took place in that little farmhouse.
Yes.
Some of it did.
Yes. There's a headquarters located just north of Harper's Ferry called the Kennedy farmhouse. It was owned by a widow at that time. He had chosen that location because of its isolation, but it's near proximity to Virginia and Harper's Ferry. The plan was well conceived long before that location. That was a gathering point. There he would bring his soldiers, his munitions, his arms, the pikes. These pikes that are out here, they were all at the Kennedy farm, assuming they're real pikes, that they're a real thing. There were an awful lot of fakes made. So assuming they're the real thing, they were at the Kennedy farm. Okay. And so the plan was well established. Almost no one knew the plan, including the people at the Kennedy farm. They didn't know the plan until the last moment. No one knew Harper's Ferry. Not even his soldiers knew that was the mission, that was the objective, except for his Secretary of War, John Kagi. Nobody else knew that. Even the Secret Six, who were a group of funders raising money for Brown in New England and New York. In fact, the richest man in New York State, a philanthropist named Gerrit Smith, was one of the Secret Six They were bringing a lot of money in for Brown. They didn't know the plan. They didn't know the location. Douglass knows. Douglass knows. But unfortunately for all these supporters, like the Secret Six and Douglass, you see, Brown didn't expect to not succeed. He didn't go into Harper's Ferry with the intention, I'm going to get captured. Let's see what happens next. So at the Kennedy farm, after his capture, they discovered that this is his headquarters. They send United States Marines up there, and boy, do they find the loot. All this incriminating correspondence that Brown hadn't stashed, hadn't destroyed, it's there. And so it implicates many of these people. And many of them fled the country temporarily. Douglass fled the country. Yeah. So yes, that's a very important place. It's preserved today. It's a National Historic Landmark. It's privately owned, but we often integrate that into our presentations on Harper's Ferry and John Brown. But yeah, that headquarters was a place that was a launch pad, more so than a place where he plans anything. I have time for one more, Kelly?
One more.
Okay.
Let's get this gentleman right.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
He's had his hand up.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Sorry I hadn't gotten to you before. Love your questions. Great questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Well, that's a good setup for this. It may not be a good question. What did you think of Ethan Hawke's portrayal?
I haven't seen it. And that's intentional. That's intentional. That's purposeful. I have absolutely zero interest in popular presentation of history. I could care less. I don't want to be influenced by it. I love when other people are influenced by it and then come to talk to me about what their experience was, and I can then say what really happened without being influenced by what didn't happen in many cases. So I don't know. I don't know. There's been many different portrayals of various characters associated with Brown and Harper's Ferry. But that was intentional. I don't know. I just, I don't care.
All right, and we'll end on that note.
No, we're not. No, we're not.
We're not
No. Does anybody have one other question that is sincerely a Brown question? And that was not a bad question. I really appreciate you asking that. Thank you very much. As a public historian, spending my whole career as a public historian, I have absolutely no interest in the popular caricature of history.
For what it's worth, my takeaway was he's complicated.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's very complicated.
I hope you got some of that. That he is very, very complicated. Yeah, he is. He is. I think I might have used the word enigma at some point. He was an enigma for the people who lived at the time, and in many respects he continues to be an enigma because we cannot define him. There are too many definitions of him, and the definitions are so diverse. And that's what makes him so exciting to discuss. Final question.
Did Brown have any political aspirations at all?
None.
None?
Hated politics. Hated politicians. I'll give you an example. Okay, the man creates his own constitution. There's no ego. He's not going to be president. He is not going to be president. No, that's not going to be him. The man's going to lead an army. Lead an army. His rank, captain. Captain. And so unlike others who in past history and present history have various ambitions, and ego is real, and I'm not being political, all politicians have ego. This is that you must have ego to be a politician. They will tell you that. Brown is really quite absent in many respects of ego. As I mentioned, everything is bigger than himself. He is an instrument of God. He's not an instrument of himself. And with that, we will conclude. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for coming out.